Let's take you now to Florida, where black politicians are struggling to draw attention to their fight for criminal justice reform. There's a new Politico article that takes a deeper look at how members of the Florida Legislative Black Caucus are fighting for police reform in that state and how their cries are mostly getting ignored. And this comes as Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a controversial anti-riot bill into law on Monday, a move critics argue is part of a strategy to limit protests in the state. With more on this, we're joined by Giulia Heyward. She's a reporter for Politico and the author of that piece. Giulia, no doubt you probably heard a little bit of our conversation with Jeff Pegues, which dovetails into our conversation with you. Let's specifically talk about Florida. Black lawmakers in that state have introduced over 20 police reform bills, but your article suggests that they're being ignored. Help us understand what's going on right now in Florida and what type of reforms these bills are calling for.
Hi, it's so great to be here right now. So earlier this session, back in February, Black lawmakers who make up what's known as the Florida Legislative Black Caucus introduced, that number right now looks closer to 25, 26 bills that are expansive when we talk about reform. These are bills that cover everything from no-knock search warrants to looking at chokeholds. These are bills that deal with mental illness training. These are bills that would significantly impact how law enforcement operates within the state. What's happening right now is that the vast majority of these bills, despite being introduced in February, have yet to be heard in either the House or the Senate.
So Tuesday, after Derek Chauvin's verdict was announced, some of the nation's top leaders, including the President of the United States and the Vice President, they spoke about the need for real change and reform. I want to play a little of what President Biden had to say.
Again, as we saw in this trial from the fellow police officers who testified, most men and women who wear the badge serve their communities honorably. But those few who fail to meet that standard must be held accountable, and they were today. One was. No one should be above the law. And today's verdict sends that message. But it's not enough. We can't stop here. In order to deliver real change and reform, we can and we must do more to reduce the likelihood that tragedies like this will ever happen and occur again.
So, you point out that black legislators have tried to introduce bills that have kind of stalled in Florida. But sometimes, what lawmakers need is a push from vocal members of their community, voters. All eyes of the country and the world were on this trial. Is there a likelihood that there is some momentum that can be taken from the Derek Chauvin trial that may have an impact on what is happening in Florida?
That is such a great question to be asking right now. I think what's important to understand with a lot of police reform legislation is that at the heart of a lot of these bills is just taking accountability. And what we saw with yesterday's verdict was what would suggest a turning of the tide when it comes to police accountability. I think really what needs to be happening right now is looking at the next few months. We need to be looking at different states within the nation. How are they going to be addressing reform? And I think that's probably going to be the best sort of hint at what's to come in the future for our nation.
So we mentioned earlier the anti-riot bill that Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed this week. Help us understand what this means for Florida and give us a sense of the controversy that's associated with it.
Yeah, so this was back on Monday that our Governor Ron DeSantis signed HB 1, otherwise known as the Combating Public Disorder Bill. Now, this bill, as DeSantis himself described, is one of the most pro-law enforcement pieces of legislation within the nation ever. This bill is sweeping. It accomplishes a lot. It enhances the jail time associated with certain offenses, bringing them from misdemeanor charges to much serious felony crimes. This includes everything from destroying a monument to obstructing a roadway, just a huge amount of riot-related offenses. At the same time, HB1 would make it increasingly more difficult for local towns to regulate the amount of funding that their law enforcement agencies receive, which is a clear nod to the defund the police movement. This legislation would also remove some of the legal culpability, from individuals, from counter-protesters who harm or kill protesters while defending property. This bill's passage was incredibly controversial in Florida. There are civil rights organizations such as the ACLU here in Florida, such as the NAACP, and even the Black Lives Matter movement that have called HB1 a serious infringement when it comes to people's right to protest.
It's almost like Florida is in this bubble when there's a national conversation about qualified immunity, whether it needs to sort of be done away with or whether it needs to be modified or changed, a conversation about expressing our dissent, because part of what you describe is what I would just call demonstrating. You're going to block a roadway, chances are if you're a large group demonstrating. The rest of the country is all talking about this stuff, and Florida is moving in the opposite direction.
I want to go back to a point that you had made about sort of seeing change, but that change sort of being slow. We are seeing some bills in Florida that are much more progressive when it comes to police reform. Right now, the Florida Senate approved what's known as the Kaya Roll Act, which would set a new standard for which would set a new standard for not arresting children under a certain age. We are seeing members of the House collaborate with Black lawmakers on a bill known as House Bill 7051, which deals with de-escalation techniques with law enforcement. We are seeing progress, but it is very slow with what I think civil rights advocates are asking for right now in this moment in Florida.
So there is this, let's talk about this one bipartisan police reform bill that's currently being debated in the Florida House. It addresses controversial police tactics. What type of reform could we see? We were talking to Jeff earlier about reforms, and Jeff made an interesting point. It's not rocket science. So what type of reform could we see if a bill like this one successfully passes?
This bill is all about de-escalation. It's all about preventing excessive use of force. Some of what we're seeing in this bill deals with giving officers training when it comes to interfering with other officers that they see using excessive force. I think what we're seeing right now is a lot of nuance and training, a lot of nuances in bringing resources to law enforcement. It is not as strong as I think civil rights advocates would like to see. I think they would like to see more sort of substantive changes, but it is, once again, sort of a push in the direction that we see the nation sort of calling for right now. I think with other reform legislation, not just in Florida, but elsewhere, you're going to see sort of the same similar trends when it comes to, training as opposed to stripping of certain resources that law enforcement have access to right now.
Well, Giulia Heyward, really interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been so great to talk to you both.